So this video is a continuation from the other one. The last video was looking at Express, just like starting up a project and how we do that. And this is a complete Express project. Those of you who did Express with me in the past will recognize it, but don't worry if you totally forgot everything or if you don't recognize it. I will walk you through this project and we'll use it as a way of refreshing on Express. So the way that I got this project is if you go to github.com/muttlez. Right here, you'll get my GitHub page, and if you go through my repositories, there's this webdev 1-2023 and lecture 3. This folder is what you need, but in order to do that, you just gotta go download the zip. You'll download the whole thing. Lecture 3 is the one that has this actual project in it. So index.js. So let's start with how do we use this project. We open up the folder in VS Code, and then we've got to actually run the project. So the first thing I do is I do npm install. What this does is it looks at the list of dependencies, which is a little bit longer here, and it goes through each and every one of those dependencies and it downloads them. So now my node modules folder, which didn't exist before, now exists. And this failed for some reason. Alright. This failed. Not sure why, honestly. Not the biggest deal right now. We're going to ignore that and we're going to move on. Because it is a problem, and it is a problem we need to solve if we were going to use this, but we're not using this. We're just using this as a demo. What this project does is it has the nodemon, is it uses nodemon and this little thingy that you didn't see in our other package.json is actually a configuration for nodemon. So it says, hey nodemon, I want you to pay attention to all of these file extensions and only these file extensions, and I want you to look in the index folder and look at the index file, watch that for changes, look in the routes folder, the models folder, and the pages folder. So let's go through what those are. So first of all, this is my index file. It's a little bit bigger than the one we had before. We'll go through it in a moment. Aside from that, I've got my static folder, which just has a CSS file. I've got my routes folder, which has some JS in it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I've got my pages folder, which has these .eta files, which you might not know what that is, but the moment you open them up, you'll notice that they're kind of HTML, but they've got like this weird if and else statements in them. So we'll explain what those are in a second. And then we've got this models folder, which has got a .sql script, which runs a database script, if you read that. It's got a database.js, which is a JavaScript file that we can kind of recognize, and we'll go through that in a minute. It's got a README file, and that README file just describes what's going on here. Now, let's take a step back. Let's start at my index.js. So my index.js has imports at the top. So this is the same thing that we were doing before, which is where the first thing that we did was we imported Express, but in this case it's not just importing Express, it's actually importing a bunch of other things. What are all those things and what are they used for? We'll talk about that in a little bit. So like .env is actually used over here. So it's a tool that loads any environmental variables. What does that mean? Don't worry about it if you're not sure. It's not important for right now. We've got Express, which loads Express. We've got cores, which allows us to properly load data while the page is open. It's a whole headache, and we'll talk about cores at a later point, but in general it allows us to do that. Body parser. What body parser does is it reads whenever we get a request, whenever we get a response from whenever we get any HTTP request, body parser takes the raw data and converts it into something that can then be read. So the fact that later on we're able to do like request.body is because we have the body parser being used. ETA or ETA is, you'll notice over here, these are ETA. This is our templating engine. What templating is it's just a way to It is a language we use for, instead of just writing a bunch of HTML pages, instead what we do is we write we use a templating language which lets us say, hey, this stuff is supposed to have this HTML around it and goes here, and then when we load a page, we pass specifically the real data into it. You're not going to need this that much in our class because we're going to rely on the fact that you're studying React and other classes. So that's ETA, and then the app. So here we create the app. So we create the app, we call Express, and that creates our Express app. And we set the port to either if there's a configured port in the environment, meaning if someone set up some configuration, then we use that. Otherwise, if no one set up a configuration, then we use 3000. So app.engine, eta.configure. This is setting up our templating engine. This allows Express to properly render our pages when we say we need them. App.set view cache, app.set view engine, app.set views. Now app.set is basically configuring our Express app, and the majority of the work that's going on here is we're configuring things. So all this is configuring your view engine, except for this last one, .views. What views does is it says, hey, this folder is the folder that you should use for views. Meaning that Express now knows that whenever anyone says, hey, I want you to render something, games-multi, for example, it knows, hey, I'm looking in pages for games/multi. Why does it know that? Because I said, hey, the views are in my pages folder. And I can set my views to be anything. To be in any folder, I just have to make sure that folder really exists so that Express will go looking there. App.use body parser.json. It's like, hey, Express app, I need you to use this middleware. App.use body parser URL encoded extended true. So I want it not only to read the body, but I also want it to read the URLs, and so we do that as well. App.use cores. This allows us to stop with a bunch of cross-origin security errors. And app.use /public express.static static. So what this does is it says, hey, if I ever have a static thing, if I'm ever going to put static files anywhere, I'm going to put them in my static, I'm going to put them in my public folder. Sorry. It says, /public is going to be from the static folder. So if we go over here, for example, if we go into my layout, and my layout says, hey, the style sheet is href /public/styles.css. So there's no public folder, but what is it? It's actually, if you look over here in my index, if we go back to my index, it's saying, hey, if anyone uses the /public if any file is using the /public, Express is going to serve static files from the static folder. Now we've got routers. So routers are a big deal. What routers are instead of me just like writing all of my paths, all of my routes, like all my app.get and all my app. I'm going to close all the other files to the right, and we're going to open them up again in a minute as we need. Instead of saying, hey, hey, Express, I want you to always use these. Instead of saying, hey, I have one file, and in that file I'm going to load every single route. What we do instead is we say, no, we're going to set specific routers. And we're going to look at one router in more depth, but we say first we just require it, which is we get it the same way we get the things up here with require. And then we do app.use, and we use, hey, this path is going to go to this router, and like this path is going to go to this router, and this path is going to go to this router. What that actually does is not, hey, if I go to / I go to the main router, and if I go to games, if I don't go to / I go to the games router. What that does is this is the prefix. So if I look at my admin router, for example, so I did a control click and it opened this file, and this file just has /init. But the full path is not /init. The full path is /admin/init. So if you ever go to /init in my project, you're not going to get anything. But if you go to /admin/init, then it'll work fine, because you're first going to have, because this prefix applies to everything in the router. Let's look at the admin router a little deeper, and then it'll tell us what all the routers are, and we'll look at the rest of them in a moment. But what's a router? So a router just got this, hey, we're going to load Express, but instead of doing Express, the base one, we're saying, no, I need a router. So express.router and then create the router. And now I also have a database link. We're going to talk more about the database in a minute, but in this project we have a database set up. Now router.get, the same way over here we have like app.all, which is an app.get, right? Which like the same way we had in our other project app.get or app.post. Over here we have router.get, because we don't want to create multiple instances of Express. Instead, we just need the router. So we create a router over here, and then we say, hey, when we say express.use, because we're exporting this router, Express is going to use the router. That's what Express, this means this becomes the router, and Express is just going to use this router, which is perfect. It's exactly what we want. In this case, it just has one method. It has an async method, and we will talk about async await in more depth, but not right now. And it has request and response, and it initializes my database, and it renders out a page that says, hey, setup complete. It renders the index page. So if we look at the index uses my layout, and it's a pretty simple page, and it just has a title and a body. And if we go back to the render, it says, hey, this is index, and then it's using the index page, and then it passes the title is setup complete, and the body is the database has been initialized. So that's what's going to load. Now if we take a step back, so those, and then there's the main router and the games router, and the main router just has a home page with a count, and this count actually comes from the database. It says, hey, how many games are in the database? This website in general, this web app in general is designed to just have a collection of board games. So here it just tells us the number of board games in our database, and the games router is where most of our interesting routes happen, and we'll go through one or two, but it's not that important to go through all of them because this is a basic walkthrough. I do recommend that you dig into it and try to understand exactly what happens. The last few things over here, so this app.listen you're used to from before, and that literally just has, hey, we're passing in a port and we're listening at that port, so that's where we're listening from. Here the port will not always be the same, because remember the port comes from above, and that might be different if it's been configured different. When is it configured and how is it configured? Don't worry about that. We'll talk about that when we talk about deploying our app. App.all, this is my 404 handler, which is basically, this is a wildcard, which means, hey, any information that goes in here, any information that gets here counts. So if someone types in a route, and I don't have that route, then the star is going to catch it, right? Because otherwise it would have already been somewhere else. The last route is the general route. But hey, if we reach a general route, we just render our 404 page with the route that you did and the method that you did. And we say, and if we look at our 404 page, it says 404 cannot be found, could not, and then it has the method and the route. So like could not get /home if that's what you tried to do, and a home page and /home doesn't exist. Notice over here something important. Sorry, this is just response.render. Over here, notice something important. Notice how this is my error handler. So this is the first function that's a little bit more elaborate. It takes in an error, request, response, and next. We're gonna so request and response we've seen before, but error is a new one, right? And what error does is if Express has an error for any reason, it's going to use this function. That's why I do app.use error handler. And what this does is it gives a status 500. It renders out the index page with the title of internal error, and then the body of that page is just going to say error.message. Hey, here's the error message that we're getting. And then I do app.use, which says, hey, Express, I want you to use this in your app. So I create the error handling function, and I say, hey, Express, you're going to use it at a certain point. So the last thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to go in depth in the games route. In the games router, we're going to look at one route, start to finish. So if I go /games, what happens? I do get /games. I get router.get, so it's going to be a basic get method for /games. What happens? We get games await db.getGames. So we know my db is my database, and if I look at get games, it's a function that gets all the games from my database. What the database is this is using SQLite. So it's going to be a flavor of SQL, except the difference is it goes into one file. because we don't spend a lot of time hooking up to databases and dealing with that structure, I like to use SQLite. This is configuring it. This is a function that initializes the database. But most importantly is the function that we're looking at is we get the games. Excuse me one second. Sorry about that. We get games, so we prepare a method. We prepare a statement. In this case, the statement is select star from games, which will just get all of the games from the games folder. And it's try. We try to actually get all the games. If it works, we return games. If it not, we log an error. So that's the function that gets the games. Now, this gets the games, which gives me a bunch of JSON, right? Those games are then returned to this function over here, which says, hey, response.render games-multi. The title is going to be all games, and then it passes just games as a second argument. So let's look at games-multi. So if I go over here into the template, the layout for this is layout. What is layout? Layout is a very basic HTML page, right? It's got the header and the footer. It has a container here, and you'll notice the last thing it has is it.body. What this is instead of having to rewrite the same header and footer, and then if I change something in my CSS or my JavaScript, I have to change it over and over again. This is a template. It allows me to create one layout and use it for everything. So now we're going to go back to the games.multi. So it's using that layout, and this little piece, this table that I'm creating, is going to go right here in the it.body. So what goes in the it.body? It goes a table with two header, with a name and a description. Those are the columns, right? And then if we look at it.games.forEach, so this is running JavaScript code. This is doing for each on games, which is, we're going to assume, an array. And then it takes each game, and what does it do? It says, hey, if you click on this, we're gonna redirect to that game. And then it sets the name as the name of the game, and then the description is some funky stuff that's effectively game.description. What is this whole substring thing? The whole substring thing is just that because some descriptions might be a lot longer than I need, we're always going to chop off at 250 characters, and then we just add 3 dots if that's not the end of the description. So that is the basics of, so that's the full stack. In Quick, what happens is the Express app gets called. We do a route for /game, so it goes to the game router. It looks at the /games. It gets games from the database, so it goes to the database to get the games. And then it renders the multi-game page. The multi-game page renders the multi-game page by passing in the title of all games and then the list of games. The title goes for the layout. So if we look at the layout page over here, we see how it says it.title, so that's where it takes the title from, and then the body is just the body. And if we go back over here, on my multi-games page, what it'll do is it takes the games, right, which is an array, and it goes through each game, and for every single game on that list, takes the game and creates a row, a TR, right, which is just a table row with with 2 cells. The first cell is going to have the name. The second cell is going to have the description, chopped off at 250 characters. But we've added one little thing here where if you click on the game, window.location.href, meaning it changes the location of the page, so it redirects your page, effectively making this a link in a weird JavaScript way to /game/game.id. So this will actually redirect to the game.id. Now what happens if I do a game/id? If we look right over here, we have get game/id. Here it'll get the ID of the game, get the game by ID, render the single game page if the game exists, otherwise we'll just redirect to the main games page. So that is, and I leave that as an exercise for you to go into more depth. That is an overview of a complete project in Express. Obviously we're not going to build the same thing again. We're going to build something similar, and we're going to go from there. So the first class that we have together, or the next class we have, we're going to spend some time building out something very basic, similar to this, not with a database yet and not with other features, and then we're going to start talking about additional features. So start thinking now about the kind of project you would want to build.